In this video, we create virtual switches and install a virtual machine on Hyper-V. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Seraltos. This video picks up where the last one left off. We have Windows Server 2022 and Hyper-V installed and ready to create VMs. Coming up, we'll create virtual networks and install a Windows Server VM. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. And check out my courses on Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, and hybrid identities between Windows AD and Enter ID. The links are below. And thank you, channel members. Your support is appreciated. Back to it. Coming up, we're going to configure an internal and external virtual switch in Hyper-V and create a VM. Before that, let's take a minute to review Hyper-V virtual switches. A virtual switch is a software-defined Layer 2 switch that's configured in Hyper-V. Virtual machines running in Hyper-V connect to the switch to communicate with other computers. There are three types of virtual switches in Hyper-V. An external virtual switch is used to connect to a wired physical network by binding to a network adapter on the host computer. This type of switch is used to connect to a physical network. An internal virtual switch does not connect to an external network. Only computers on the host and the host computer itself can connect to an internal virtual switch. A private virtual switch only connects VMs on the Hyper-V host. Unlike an internal virtual switch, the host cannot connect to a private virtual switch. A Hyper-V virtual machine can connect to multiple virtual switches. We could add a virtual router or firewall between an internal and an external virtual switch to allow connectivity from a computer on the internal network to an external network, for example. A virtual switch also supports VLAN IDs or tagging. This allows us to isolate network traffic by tagging packets from different networks. Once we have the virtual switches in place, we'll create a virtual machine in Hyper-V and then attach it to the external network and then attach it to the internal network. If you'd like to follow along, you will need an ISO of the Windows installation media. I'll include a link to the Windows Evaluation Center below. Let's jump into Hyper-V to get started. Here we are logged into the Hyper-V server. Let's start with networking. We need a network for our VMs to attach to so they can communicate with other computers. To begin, we'll search for and then open View Network Connections. There it is. Let's change the view to details so we can see all of the device name. This computer has two network cards, but only one is plugged into a switch. We could connect both to an external switch and then use one solely for our virtual switch, but for this example, only one will be used. If you have multiple NICs, make a note of the device name of the network card we're going to use for our external connection. That's the device name, not the name. Only the device name shows in Hyper-V. Let's go to Hyper-V Manager next. From Hyper-V Manager, we'll select our host. Not much here. Let's change that. Go to Virtual Switch Manager. We have the option to add a new virtual switch and another to set the global MAC address range. We'll leave the MAC address ranges set to default and add a virtual switch. There are three options. External, that's for connectivity between VMs in Hyper-V, as well as computers attached to the physical network. We can also use that to route traffic to the internet. Internal, this allows traffic to other VMs on the host and the host computer itself. And a private virtual switch, this only connects to VMs on the host with no network connectivity to the physical host. Keep in mind, we can create multiple virtual switches and attach VMs to more than one. I have a video on creating a point-to-point VPN between an on-premises Hyper-V environment and Azure that uses routing and remote access server and an internal and external network. I'll provide the link below. For now, we're going to create an external, then an internal virtual switch. With external selected, click on Create Virtual Switch. Give it a name. For this example, we'll call it External vSwitch. You can add comments if you'd like. If you have multiple NICs on the computer, select the one you want to use. It should be the network card plugged into an external switch so we can communicate outside of the virtual switch. We can leave Allow Management set as is, and we don't need to enable single root I/O. We're also not going to set a VLAN tag. We'll click OK. We're adjusting network settings on the physical NIC and it may disconnect momentarily. I remoted into this computer, so the connection will drop for a few seconds and I may have to reconnect. I'll click yes and come back once it reconnects. Okay, we're back. It reconnected. Let's take a look at Virtual Switch Manager. Here's our external vSwitch. We can make changes here as needed. Next, let's add an internal switch. Go to New Virtual Network Switch. We'll select Internal and create Virtual Switch. We have less options with an internal and private network switch. We want to give this a new name. Internal vSwitch. And we'll click OK to apply. Now we can go back into Virtual Switch Manager and view the settings for the internal switch. We can close this out. Now that we have the virtual switches in place, next up, we install a Server 2022 virtual machine. This host has a folder on the data drive called ISO. In that folder, I have, an ISO for the Windows Server 2022 install. Let's go back to Hyper-V Manager, and from here we'll add a new virtual machine. We can click Next at Before You Begin. Let's give it a name. We'll call this one Test VM1. We can use the default location to store the VM configuration or specify a different location. I'm going to create a folder specifically for Test VM1. So let's check Store the virtual machine in a different location, and we'll add Test VM1 to the path. Next, here we have the VM generation. A Gen 1 VM supports more OS types, but uses the older BIOS-based boot. Gen 2 supports UEFI-based boot firmware and some newer features. This example uses a Server 2022 OS, so Gen 2 will work fine. We'll go Next. We'll assign the memory. 1 gig is a little bit small for Windows Server. We'll bump that up to 8 gigs or 8,192 megabytes. Hyper-V has an option to dynamically manage RAM on the client VMs. Windows computers often have more RAM allocated than they need to use. With dynamic memory enabled, the VM will get all of the RAM we specify at startup. Then RAM will be reclaimed dynamically if it's not used after the boot. We can get greater VM density by overcommitting RAM with this option. For this example, I'll leave dynamic memory off and go to Next. Here we'll select the network to connect to. This example will use the external virtual switch we just created. We'll go Next. Here we can specify the name, location, and size of the OS disk. The default is to put the OS disk under the configuration location we specified earlier. We'll leave that as it is. We can modify the virtual disk size. We could also use an existing virtual disk if we had one, or attach a virtual disk later. Click Next. This brings us to the options for installing the OS on the virtual machine. We can install the OS later. For this example, we'll select a bootable image. Let's navigate to the ISO files. And we'll select that Server 2022 ISO file. And the third option is for installing the OS over the network. Let's go Next. That brings us to the summary. Review the settings, and if it all looks good, click Finish. That creates the VM, the virtual NIC, and connects it to our virtual switch. Let's open up the VM next. We can double-click on it or right-click and connect. The VM is powered off. Let's start the VM and the OS install. We get a message to click any key to boot to the CD or DVD. We're actually booting from a virtual CD. That's the ISO file we connected earlier. This starts the install. I'm going to go through the installation quickly. I covered it in more detail in the last video. We'll click Next at the language, time, and keyboard support, and install now. This is just a test, so I'm not going to enter a product key and activate it. Once I have the computer configured the way I need it, I'll add the key and activate it then. For now, select I don't have a product key. From here, we can select what we want to install. I'll install Windows Server 2022 Data Center with the desktop experience. Accept the license term to continue. And I'm going to do a custom install. There's only one drive and there's no date on it. Make sure that's selected and click Next. That will start the install process. I'm going to pause here and come back once it's done. The install is just about complete. We need to add a password for the local admin account. Now we can log in. Using Control-Alt-Delete from the keyboard will lock the local computer, not the virtual machine. So instead, we'll click on these three buttons up here, and that sends Control-Alt-Delete to the virtual machine. Now we can log in. It takes a minute to set up the local admin user profile. And now we're logged into the virtual machine. Now that we're logged in, let's verify network connectivity. We're connected to the external network, and in my environment, that external network has a DHCP server. So let's run command and type ipconfig to view the IP configuration. It got an IPv4 address, and that address is part of my external or my physical network in this home lab. So that's good. That means our external virtual network is carrying traffic from the physical network, and I should be able to access the internet. We can ping an external IP address, so that's good. That means I have internet connectivity. Next, let's change the virtual switch from the external to internal. I'm going to shut down the VM. We can close this. We'll go to Settings, Network Adapter, and here we can switch it from the external switch to the internal switch. We'll apply and OK. And now let's start the VM. We'll log in. We'll close Server Manager. Open the command prompt. And ipconfig. The IPv4 address starts with 169.254. That's an automatic private IP address. That means it wasn't able to communicate with the DHCP server. Also notice there's no default gateway. Because we switched to the internal network, there's no connectivity to any DHCP server. We haven't set that up on the private network yet. This is the result we expect. That indicates that that internal network is truly internal. It's not connected to that external network. That is how to configure an external and internal virtual switch and install a VM on Hyper-V. I hope this helps you better understand how to create virtual networks and install a virtual machine on Hyper-V. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.